Good evening, friends. Tonight, we'll drift slowly into a world wrapped in ice and silence, where the snow falls so gently it barely makes a sound, and the air is so cold it seems to hum with its own quiet song. I want you to imagine, just for a moment, that you're sitting beside a fire that crackles softly in the darkness, its warmth reaching out to you like a gentle hand. The flames dance in shades of amber and gold, casting shadows that sway across walls of earth and hide, and outside, the winter wind whispers stories older than any book could ever tell. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your part of the world? Perhaps the evening has already settled around you, or maybe dawn is just beginning to break where you are. Wherever you find yourself, I invite you to dim your lights, if you haven't already. Rest your head on your pillow, letting it cradle you in softness. Allow your breathing to soften, each breath a little slower, a little deeper, as if you're syncing your rhythm with the quiet pulse of the earth itself. Tonight's journey will carry us into the lives of native tribes who endured winters so fierce, so unrelenting, that it seems impossible the human body could withstand them. Yet they did more than survive. They thrived, they laughed, they loved, they told stories by firelight, and they shared meals that warmed them from the inside out. We'll explore how they built their homes, what they ate when the snow buried the world, how they found joy in the darkest months, and what wisdom they carried that allowed them to live in harmony with a landscape that could easily have destroyed them. If this peaceful journey helps you unwind, feel free to like and subscribe, only if it feels right to you. There's no pressure here, no urgency. Just you, me, and the slow unfolding of a story that time has almost forgotten. So let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw relax. And as I begin to tell you about the people who walked through blizzards as if they were merely whispers, allow yourself to drift wherever your mind wants to go. There's no need to hold on to every word. Just let the story wash over you like warm water, and if sleep comes to find you along the way, welcome it like an old friend. Now, take one more deep breath, and let's begin. Let me share with you how it all began each autumn, when the air would turn crisp and the geese would start their long journey south, honking their farewells across skies that seemed impossibly wide. The tribes knew, as surely as they knew the taste of water and the warmth of the sun, that winter was coming. And not just any winter, but the kind of winter that could freeze a river solid in a single night, that could bury a forest under 10 feet of snow, that could turn your breath into ice crystals before it even left your lips. The people didn't panic. They didn't scramble. Instead, they moved with a quiet, ancient confidence, because this was a dance they had perfected over thousands of years. Imagine the gentle scent of pine and earth as they began to prepare, the soft murmur of voices planning and organizing, children running between the adults with bundles of dried grass and branches, everyone moving with purpose but never with haste. In the northern plains, where the wind could cut through you like a blade made of cold itself, tribes like the Mandan and Hidatsa built homes that seem almost impossible when you first hear about them. They created earth lodges, massive domed structures that could house entire extended families, sometimes 30 or 40 people all together. Picture this, a circular framework of cottonwood logs, some as thick as a person's torso, carefully arranged and interlocked like the ribs of some great sleeping beast. Over this frame, they layered willow branches, then thick bundles of prairie grass, and finally, they covered the entire structure with packed earth, sometimes 2 or 3 feet thick. The earth itself became their insulation, their shield against the howling wind and the bone-deep cold. Inside, in the very center, a fire pit would glow day and night, its smoke rising up through a hole in the roof, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and whatever was cooking for dinner. The walls were lined with sleeping platforms covered in buffalo robes, soft, thick, warm, and the temperature inside could be remarkably comfortable, even when outside the world was frozen solid. There's something comforting about this part of the story, isn't there? The idea that you could be warm and safe while the storm raged outside, that you could gather with the people you loved and share food and stories while the wind tried its hardest to reach you but couldn't quite manage it. And speaking of food, let me tell you about one of the sweet treats that would appear during these winter months. The tribes would harvest wild plums in late summer and early autumn, when the fruit was at its peak, and they would dry these plums slowly in the sun, preserving them for the long months ahead. By winter, these dried plums would be as sweet as candy, their flavor concentrated and rich, with just a hint of tartness that made your mouth water. Children would suck on them slowly, making them last, and adults would add them to stews or pound them into pemmican, that legendary food we'll talk more about later. The plums would have been harvested sometime in September, just before the first frost, and the drying process would take about 2 weeks, turning the flesh dark and chewy and absolutely delicious. But let me also tell you about something savory that kept them going through the coldest days. The tribes had perfected the art of preserving fish, especially in the regions near the Great Lakes and the northern rivers. They would catch whitefish, pike, and trout in massive quantities during the autumn runs, and then they would smoke these fish over low fires for days on end, until the flesh became firm and dry and infused with that deep, woodsy flavor that only smoking can provide. A single smoked fish could last for months, and when winter hunger struck, they would break off pieces of this fish, sometimes eating it plain, sometimes boiling it into a rich, oily broth that warmed you from your belly all the way out to your fingertips. The smoking would typically begin in October, right around the time of the hunter's moon, when the nights grew long and the fish were fat with the abundance of summer. And then there was the unusual snack that might make you pause: dried lichen. Yes, lichen, that strange, almost alien-looking organism that grows on rocks and trees, part fungus and part algae living in mysterious partnership. Some tribes, particularly the Athabascan peoples of the far north, would gather certain types of lichen, boil them to remove bitterness, and then dry them into crispy sheets that could be eaten like chips or rehydrated into a kind of porridge. It wasn't particularly flavorful on its own. Imagine something earthy and slightly nutty, with a texture somewhere between seaweed and paper, but it was rich in carbohydrates and could be the difference between life and death when game was scarce and the snow was too deep to travel. The gathering of lichen happened year-round, but it was in winter that its value truly shone, when it might be the only food available for weeks at a time. The earth lodges weren't just physical structures, they were spiritual ones too. The circular shape represented the cycle of life, the seasons, the eternal return. The central fire was the heart, the source of warmth and light and community. Everything had meaning, everything had purpose, and nothing was wasted. The very positioning of these lodges was carefully considered. They were often built near rivers for water access, but set back far enough to avoid spring flooding, and they were positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks like hills or tree lines. As the snow began to fall in earnest, usually by late November in most regions, the tribes would gather inside their homes and settle into the rhythm of winter life. The men would work on tools and weapons, carving new arrow shafts, sharpening blades, repairing snowshoes. The women would work on hides, creating the clothing and blankets that would keep everyone warm, their hands moving in patterns passed down through countless generations. The elders would tell stories, their voices soft and rhythmic, weaving tales of creation and adventure, of trickster spirits and great heroes, and the children would listen with wide eyes, learning the history and wisdom of their people. There's something deeply soothing about imagining this scene, isn't there? The fire crackling, the soft murmur of conversation, the gentle sounds of work being done, all of it wrapped in the knowledge that outside the wind might be howling but inside, you are safe, you are warm, you are home. It's surprising how such simple materials, earth, grass, wood, could create such effective shelter. Modern architects study these structures even now, marveling at their thermal efficiency, their structural integrity, and their elegant solution to the problem of extreme cold. The native peoples didn't have textbooks or engineering degrees, but they had something perhaps more valuable: thousands of years of observation, experimentation, and accumulated wisdom, passed from parent to child in an unbroken chain stretching back into the mists of time. And now, as your body relaxes deeper, as your breathing becomes slower and steadier, allow your mind to float gently into the next chapter, where we'll explore how these remarkable people moved through the frozen landscape, how they traveled when the snow was deeper than a person was tall, and how they found their way through blizzards that could erase the world in white. And then there was the unusual snack that might make you pause: dried lichen. Yes, lichen, that strange, almost alien-looking organism that grows on rocks and trees, part fungus and part algae living in mysterious partnership. Some tribes, particularly the Athabascan peoples of the far north, would gather certain types of lichen, boil them to remove bitterness, and then dry them into crispy sheets that could be eaten like chips or rehydrated into a kind of porridge. It wasn't particularly flavorful on its own. Imagine something earthy and slightly nutty, with a texture somewhere between seaweed and paper. But it was rich in carbohydrates and could be the difference between life and death when game was scarce and the snow was too deep to travel. The gathering of lichen happened year-round, but it was in winter that its value truly shone, when it might be the only food available for weeks at a time. The earth lodges weren't just physical structures, they were spiritual ones too. The circular shape represented the cycle of life, the seasons, the eternal return. The central fire was the heart, the source of warmth and light and community. Everything had meaning, everything had purpose, and nothing was wasted. The very positioning of these lodges was carefully considered. They were often built near rivers for water access, but set back far enough to avoid spring flooding, and they were positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks like hills or tree lines. As the snow began to fall in earnest, usually by late November in most regions, the tribes would gather inside their homes and settle into the rhythm of winter life. The men would work on tools and weapons, carving new arrow shafts, sharpening blades, repairing snowshoes. The women would work on hides, creating the clothing and blankets that would keep everyone warm, their hands moving in patterns passed down through countless generations. The elders would tell stories, their voices soft and rhythmic, weaving tales of creation and adventure, of trickster spirits and great heroes, and the children would listen with wide eyes, learning the history and wisdom of their people. There's something deeply soothing about imagining this scene, isn't there? The fire crackling, the soft murmur of conversation, the gentle sounds of work being done, all of it wrapped in the knowledge that outside the wind might be howling but inside, you are safe, you are warm, you are home. It's surprising how such simple materials, earth, grass, wood, could create such effective shelter. Modern architects study these structures even now, marveling at their thermal efficiency, their structural integrity, and their elegant solution to the problem of extreme cold. The native peoples didn't have textbooks or engineering degrees, but they had something perhaps more valuable: thousands of years of observation, experimentation, and accumulated wisdom, passed from parent to child in an unbroken chain stretching back into the mists of time. And now, as your body relaxes deeper, as your breathing becomes slower and steadier, allow your mind to float gently into the next chapter, where we'll explore how these remarkable people moved through the frozen landscape, how they traveled when the snow was deeper than a person was tall, and how they found their way through blizzards that could erase the world in white. Picture this, if you will. A landscape so white and so vast that the earth and sky blend together into one endless expanse of brightness. The snow is deep, so deep that if you tried to walk through it without preparation, you would sink down past your waist with every step, exhausting yourself in minutes, your legs burning with effort, your lungs gasping in the thin, cold air. But the native peoples who lived in these regions had solved this problem long before recorded history began, and their solution was so elegant, so perfectly adapted to the environment, that it remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. They invented snowshoes, though invented seems too small a word for something so crucial to survival. These weren't the modern aluminum and nylon versions you might see in sporting goods stores today. These were works of art and engineering combined, crafted from bent wood frames, usually ash or birch, and webbing made from rawhide, typically caribou or moose, though sometimes deer or elk when those were available. The frames were steamed and bent into shape, usually an oval or a teardrop, and the webbing was laced in intricate patterns that distributed the wearer's weight across a much larger surface area, allowing them to walk on top of the snow rather than sinking through it. Imagine the gentle scent of wood smoke and leather as someone sits by the fire, carefully working on a pair of snowshoes, their hands moving with practiced precision. The rawhide must be stretched just right. Too loose and it will sag and fail, too tight and it will break in the cold. The lacing pattern varies by tribe and region, each with its own subtle variations passed down through generations, and an experienced eye can tell where a person comes from just by looking at their snowshoes. The feeling of walking on snowshoes takes some getting used to. You have to widen your stance slightly, lifting your feet in a rolling motion rather than a normal stride, but once you master the technique, you can move across the snow with surprising speed and efficiency. Hunters could track game for miles, following trails that would be impossible to traverse any other way. Traders could travel between villages, maintaining the social connections that were so vital to survival. Scouts could range far and wide, keeping watch for game herds or potential dangers. In the far north, the Inuit and Yupik peoples took winter travel even further. They created sleds, kamutiks, built from pieces of driftwood lashed together with sinew and rawhide, sometimes reinforced with strips of baleen from whales. These sleds were pulled by dog teams, those incredible animals who seemed to relish the cold that would kill a human in hours. The relationship between the people and their dogs was deep and complex. The dogs weren't pets in the modern sense, but they weren't just tools either. They were partners, essential members of the community, and they were cared for accordingly, fed and sheltered and respected. The lead dog, the one who set the pace and made decisions about the route, was often the most valued possession a family could have, worth more than any material object. These dogs could sense thin ice, could find their way home through a wide-out blizzard, could detect the scent of a seal breathing hole from hundreds of yards away. They were bred over thousands of years for strength, endurance, and intelligence, and the bond between a musher and their lead dog could be as close as family. Let me tell you about a sweet food that travelers would carry with them on these winter journeys. The tribes would make a kind of candy from the sap of maple trees, though not in the way you might imagine if you're thinking of modern maple syrup. They would tap the trees in very early spring, when the sap began to flow but winter's grip hadn't quite loosened, and they would boil this sap down into a thick, sticky concentrate. This concentrate could be poured onto snow, where it would harden into a taffy-like candy, or it could be formed into small cakes that traveled well and provided a quick burst of energy and sweetness when you needed it most. The maple sugar would have been made typically in March, during the sugar moon, and a single tree could provide several pounds of sugar over the course of the season. Travelers would carry these maple sugar cakes in small pouches, breaking off pieces to suck on during long treks, the sweetness a reminder of warmer days to come. But there was also savory sustenance for the trail, and this is where pemmican enters our story in earnest. Pemmican was perhaps the most important travel food ever developed by native peoples, a concentrated mixture of dried meat, rendered fat, and dried berries that could last for years if properly prepared and stored. The meat, usually buffalo, caribou, or deer, would be cut into thin strips and dried until it was completely desiccated, then pounded into a powder or shredded into fine pieces. Fat would be rendered slowly over low heat until it was pure and clean, and then the dried meat would be mixed with this fat in roughly equal proportions, along with dried berries for flavor and additional nutrients. The result was a dense, calorie-rich food that wouldn't spoil, wouldn't freeze into uselessness, and provided everything a traveling person needed to maintain their strength. A pound of pemmican could sustain a person for a day of hard travel, and it could be eaten as is or boiled into a hearty stew when time and conditions permitted. The preparation of pemmican usually happened in late summer and early autumn, around August and September, when game was plentiful and the weather was warm enough for drying. And then there's the unusual travel food that might make you raise an eyebrow: frozen raw fish. In the Arctic regions, people would catch fish and simply allow them to freeze solid, then pack them for travel. When you wanted to eat, you would use a knife to shave off thin slices of this frozen fish, eating it raw while it was still icy cold. It sounds bizarre to modern ears, but frozen fish prepared this way is actually remarkably good. Clean tasting, slightly sweet, and very safe to eat because the freezing killed any parasites. This method of eating fish, sometimes called stroganina in modern times, was not only practical but actually preserved nutrients that would be lost in cooking. The fish would be caught through the ice during winter fishing expeditions, typically from December through February, when the ice was thick enough to support the weight of people and their gear. There's something almost meditative about imagining these winter journeys, isn't there? The rhythmic swish of snowshoes, the soft panting of the dogs, the vast silence of the winter landscape, broken only by the occasional call of a raven or the crack of a tree splitting in the cold. The world is reduced to its essentials: movement, breath, the thin line between survival and oblivion. The night travel was perhaps even more remarkable. The tribes learned to navigate by the stars, of course, but also by the subtle signs that most of us would never notice. The way snow drifts form in relation to the prevailing wind, creating natural compasses. The slight difference in how trees grow on the north versus south side of a hill. The angle of the moon's arc across the sky. The texture of the snow itself, which changes depending on temperature and wind and sun exposure. And when storms came, as they inevitably did, the experienced traveler knew how to read the signs and find shelter. They would build snow shelters, quinzees or snow caves, in a remarkably short time, hollowing out drifts or piling up snow and then burrowing inside. The snow itself became insulation, the air trapped in its crystalline structure creating a barrier against the wind. Inside these temporary shelters, travelers would huddle together for warmth, sometimes with their dogs curled around them, sharing body heat, waiting for the storm to pass. A small fire might be lit if conditions allowed, just enough to take the edge off the cold, but too much heat would melt the walls and collapse the shelter. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. The Inuit people had more than 50 different words for different types of snow, each describing a specific condition or quality. Snow that was good for building. Snow that was good for drinking water. Snow that would support the weight of a person or sled. Snow that would collapse under your feet. Snow that had been blown by the wind. Snow that had fallen fresh. Each type required different responses, different strategies, and knowing these distinctions could mean the difference between life and death. What began as necessity evolved into a kind of poetry, a language of winter that expressed intimate knowledge of the world in its most challenging form. These weren't primitive people struggling against nature, as early European explorers often characterized them. These were sophisticated cultures with deep understanding of their environment, people who had learned to thrive in conditions that would kill the unprepared in hours. And now, allow your mind to float gently into the next chapter, where we'll explore what happened when the hunting was good, how the tribes processed and preserved their food, and the communal celebrations that brought light and joy into the darkest months of the year. There's a rhythm to winter survival that pulses like a heartbeat, slow and steady, a rhythm of feast and careful conservation, of abundance and scarcity, of communal celebration and quiet endurance. The native tribes who lived through these impossible winters understood this rhythm in their bones, and they organized their lives around it with a wisdom that seems almost miraculous when you really stop to think about it. Let me share with you what happened when the hunting was good, when the hunters returned to the village with enough meat to feed everyone, when the stores were full and the future looked bright. These were the feast days, and they were celebrated with a joy and gratitude that is hard to describe to those of us who have never faced true scarcity, who have never known the relief of having enough food to see your family through another week, another month. The hunt itself was often a communal affair, particularly the great buffalo hunts of the Plains tribes or the caribou hunts of the northern peoples. Imagine dozens or even hundreds of people moving together with coordinated purpose, scouts tracking the herd's movements, spiritual leaders performing ceremonies to ensure success and honor the animal spirits, hunters positioning themselves with careful strategy. The buffalo jump, the pishkin, was one of the most dramatic and effective hunting methods ever devised. The tribes would build converging lines of rock cairns stretching for miles, creating a funnel that led to a cliff edge. Then, with incredible skill and coordination, they would stampede a buffalo herd along these lines, driving them faster and faster until the animals at the front had no choice but to go over the cliff, pulled forward by the momentum of those behind them. It sounds brutal to modern ears, and in some ways it was, but it was also profoundly respectful. Every part of the buffalo was used. Every single part. The meat, of course, but also the hides for clothing and shelter, the bones for tools and weapons, the sinew for thread and bowstrings, the horns for cups and decorations, the bladder for containers, the hooves for glue, even the dung for fuel when wood was scarce. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was taken lightly. The tribes understood that these animals gave their lives so that the people could live, and that gift was honored in every possible way. After a successful hunt, the real work began. The women and men, for this was work that involved everyone, would butcher the animals with practiced efficiency, their knives moving with swift precision, cutting and separating, sorting and organizing. The meat had to be preserved quickly, especially in autumn when the weather might still be relatively warm. Some would be cooked immediately, roasted over open fires, boiled in hide-lined pits with hot stones, the rich smell of cooking meat filling the air and making everyone's mouth water in anticipation. But most of the meat would be preserved for the winter ahead. Thin strips would be cut and hung on drying racks, where the sun and wind would slowly desiccate them, creating jerky that could last for months. Fattier pieces would be rendered down for their precious oils, that liquid gold that provided not just calories but warmth from within, that essential fuel for maintaining body temperature in extreme cold. Some meat would be made into pemmican, as we discussed before, but there were other preservation methods too, varying by tribe and region and specific conditions. In the far north, where temperatures dropped so low that bacteria simply couldn't survive, meat could be cached in the permafrost, buried in pits that stayed frozen year-round, creating natural deep freezers that could preserve food for months or even years. The Inuit would hunt seals and walruses, and the fat from these marine mammals was absolutely crucial to survival, providing the concentrated calories needed to maintain body heat in temperatures that could drop to 50 below zero or even colder. Let me tell you about a sweet treat that appeared during the feast times, something that might surprise you. The tribes would harvest cattail roots, those common plants that grow in marshy areas, and they would process these roots to extract the starch. This cattail starch could be mixed with water and sweetened with maple sugar or dried berries, then shaped into little cakes and dried or gently fried in rendered fat. The result was something like a cookie or a biscuit, slightly sweet, with a pleasant nutty flavor and a texture that was both chewy and crumbly. Children would receive these as special treats during celebrations, and the sight of young faces lighting up with joy at the taste of something sweet is universal across all cultures and all times. The harvesting of cattail roots typically happened in late autumn, around October and early November, just before the marshes froze completely, and it required wading into cold water and using digging sticks to loosen the roots from the mud. But there was also hearty, savory food that defined these feast days, and one of the most important was bone marrow. After the animals were butchered and the meat was dealt with, the bones would be cracked open to reveal the rich, fatty marrow inside. This marrow would be roasted until it was soft and oily, or boiled into broths that were so nutritious and calorie-dense that they could revive someone who was on the edge of starvation. The taste is hard to describe if you've never had it. Rich, deeply savory, almost buttery in texture, with a flavor that speaks to something primal in human biology, that recognition of highly nutritious food that our ancestors evolved to crave. Bone marrow soup, made with water, marrow, a bit of meat, and whatever vegetables or tubers were available, would simmer over the fire for hours, the smell permeating the entire lodge or camp, promising warmth and fullness and comfort. This cooking often happened immediately after a successful hunt, usually within a day or two while the bones were still fresh, typically in late autumn around November or during winter hunts throughout the cold months. And then there was the unusual food that might make you pause in curiosity: fermented fish heads. Some tribes, particularly in Alaska and the Arctic, would take salmon heads and bury them in pits lined with bark or grass, allowing them to ferment over several weeks or even months. The fermentation process, driven by natural bacteria, would break down the proteins and fats into a soft, pungent paste that was, by all accounts, extremely nutritious and even considered a delicacy. The taste is described as intense, strongly fishy, with a sharp, tangy flavor from the fermentation. It's definitely an acquired taste, and one that most modern palates would find challenging, But in a diet that could be low in certain vitamins, these fermented foods provided crucial nutrients that might otherwise be lacking. The preparation would typically begin in summer when the salmon runs were happening, usually around July or August, and the fermentation would continue through autumn, with the food being ready to eat by early winter. There's something comforting about this part of the story, isn't there? The idea of a community coming together, everyone working toward the shared goal of survival, everyone contributing what they could, the strong helping the weak, the skilled teaching the inexperienced. The feast days weren't just about food, though food was central. They were about reinforcing social bonds, about expressing gratitude, about remembering that they were all in this together, that survival wasn't an individual achievement but a communal one. The celebrations during these times would include dancing, singing, storytelling, and games. The drums would beat out rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the earth itself, and people would dance for hours, their movements telling stories of the hunt, of legendary heroes, of the spirits that guided and protected them. The firelight would cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the sound of laughter and song would push back against the darkness outside, creating a bubble of warmth and joy and human connection. But the tribes also knew that not every moon would be a feast moon. There would be hungry times, times when the game was scarce or the weather was too dangerous to hunt, times when the stores would run low and every meal had to be carefully rationed. These were the hungry moons, usually in late winter when the supplies from autumn were depleted and spring was still weeks or months away. During these times, the people would fall back on their preserved foods, eating sparingly, making every bit of pemmican and jerky last as long as possible. The elders would remind the young ones that these lean times were part of the cycle, that they had been through it before and would come through it again, that spring would always return no matter how long and dark the winter seemed. They would tell stories of past winters, of times even harder than the present, and how their ancestors had survived through wisdom and cooperation and sheer stubborn endurance. It's surprising how much emotional and spiritual resilience was required, perhaps even more than physical toughness. The ability to remain hopeful when the food was running out, to stay calm when the blizzard had been raging for 3 days straight, to find joy in small things like a child's laugh or a moment of sunshine breaking through the clouds. These were the skills that kept communities intact and sane through months of darkness and cold. And now, as your breathing becomes slower and steadier, as your body sinks deeper into relaxation, allow your mind to drift gently into the next chapter, where we'll explore the clothing that kept people warm, the incredible engineering of winter garments that modern technology still struggles to match, and the care and skill that went into creating these essential items. There's a particular kind of cold that's hard to explain if you've never experienced it, a cold that doesn't just chill your skin but seems to reach inside you, trying to pull the warmth from your very core. It's the kind of cold where exposed skin can freeze in minutes, where metal becomes so brittle it can shatter, where your breath freezes into ice crystals that tinkle as they fall. In this kind of cold, clothing isn't just fashion or comfort, it's the thin layer between life and death, and the native tribes who lived in these environments understood this with a clarity that most of us will never need. Let me share with you the incredible sophistication of their winter clothing, garments that were the result of thousands of years of experimentation and refinement, each detail serving a crucial purpose. Imagine the gentle scent of tanned hide and smoke as someone sits by the fire, working on a new parka, their hands moving with the sureness that comes from a lifetime of practice. The basic principle was layering, something that modern outdoor enthusiasts have rediscovered and treat as cutting-edge knowledge, but the native peoples perfected this technique long before the first European ever set foot in the Americas. The first layer, closest to the skin, would be soft, thin hide or furs, usually caribou or deer, worn with the hair side facing inward against the skin. This layer trapped a thin layer of air warmed by body heat, creating insulation while also wicking away moisture from perspiration. It's crucial to understand that moisture is the enemy in extreme cold. If your clothing gets wet from sweat, it loses its insulating properties and can actually conduct heat away from your body, leading to hypothermia even when you're physically active. The second layer would be thicker, usually caribou hide for the northern tribes or buffalo hide for the plains peoples, worn with the hair facing outward. This outer layer provided additional insulation and protection from wind, which is often more dangerous than cold itself. Wind chill can drop the effective temperature by 30 or 40 degrees, and without wind protection, even the best insulation is useless. The hides were prepared with incredible care, a process that could take weeks for a single garment. The hide would be scraped clean of meat and fat, then soaked, then stretched, then worked until it was soft and supple, then smoked to make it water-resistant and prevent it from stiffening when it got wet and dried again. The parkas, the classic cold-weather garment, were works of art as much as functional items. They were carefully tailored to fit the individual, with longer backs to protect when sitting, hoods that could be drawn tight to protect the face, and careful attention to preventing gaps where cold air could penetrate. The hoods were often lined with wolverine or wolf fur around the face opening, because these furs have a unique property. The guard hairs are so smooth and water-repellent that your breath doesn't condense and freeze on them the way it does on other furs. When you're out in 50 below weather, this matters more than you might think, because ice buildup around your face can be dangerous and extremely uncomfortable. The hands and feet required special attention, as these extremities are the first to suffer frostbite. Mittens were far more common than gloves, because keeping the fingers together allowed them to share warmth. These mittens would be made from multiple layers: inner mittens of soft hide, outer mittens of thicker, more weather-resistant material, sometimes with an additional shell that could be added in extreme conditions. A person might have 3 or 4 pairs of mittens, rotating them as needed, drying the damp ones by the fire while wearing the dry ones. Boots were perhaps the most crucial and most difficult items to make correctly. They needed to be waterproof, insulated, flexible enough to walk in, and durable enough to withstand rough use. The traditional mukluk or kamek was a marvel of design, typically made from seal skin for waterproofing, lined with fur for insulation, and carefully sewn with special stitching that made the seams watertight. The soles would be made from thick, tough hide, sometimes with the hair left on for better traction on ice. Inside, there would be insulating layers of dried grass or moss that could be changed out when they became damp from foot perspiration. The stitching was done with sinew, which would swell slightly when it got wet, making the seams even tighter and more waterproof. Let me tell you about a sweet food that was associated with the women who made these garments, a little treat that provided energy during the long hours of detailed work. Berries, blueberries, cranberries, salmonberries depending on the region, would be mashed and mixed with rendered fat and a touch of maple sugar if available, then formed into small balls or patties and dried. These little berry cakes were rich, sweet, and packed with energy, perfect for eating while your hands were busy with sewing or other detailed work. The preparation would happen in summer when the berries were ripe, typically July and August, with the women and children heading out together to gather, making it a social activity as much as a practical one. A good berry patch was a treasured resource, remembered and returned to year after year, sometimes for generations. But there was also savory sustenance that kept the workers going through long winter days. Smoked tongue, whether from buffalo, caribou, or deer, was considered a delicacy and was particularly prized by those doing detailed work that required concentration. The tongue would be smoked until it was dark and firm, then sliced thin and eaten as is, or sometimes lightly cooked over the fire. The taste is rich and deeply meaty, with a texture that's tender but substantial, and a smokiness that adds complexity. This was food that provided not just calories but also a sense of luxury, a reminder that life was about more than mere survival. The smoking would happen whenever a large animal was taken, usually in autumn during the big hunts, around September and October, and the tongues were often set aside specifically for the skilled craftspeople as a mark of respect for their essential work. And then there was the unusual item that served both as emergency food and as insulation material: dried moss and lichen. Certain types of moss, particularly the sphagnum moss common in northern wetlands, would be gathered in large quantities in late summer and dried thoroughly. This dried moss served multiple purposes. It was used as insulation in boots and mittens, as we mentioned, but it could also be eaten in emergency situations when no other food was available. It had to be prepared carefully, boiled to remove bitterness and any potential toxins, then dried again or mixed with fat to make it more palatable. It wasn't exactly delicious, but it was rich in carbohydrates and could keep you alive when nothing else was available. The gathering would happen in late summer, typically August, when the moss was at its peak growth and the wetlands were most accessible. There's something almost meditative about imagining the creation of these garments, isn't there? The steady rhythm of the needle moving through the hide, the careful planning required to make seams strong and placement optimal, the way each stitch was a small act of love and protection for whoever would wear the finished piece. These weren't mass-produced items cranked out in factories. Each one was made by hand, often by the women of the household, and each one carried with it the maker's skill and care. The decoration of these garments was also significant. Beadwork, quillwork, embroidery with dyed moose hair or plant fibers, these weren't just aesthetic choices, though beauty was certainly valued. The patterns often had spiritual or cultural meaning, identifying which tribe or family the wearer belonged to, or depicting protective symbols meant to keep the wearer safe. A young person receiving their first adult set of winter clothing would know that it represented hundreds of hours of work, that someone had put tremendous effort into ensuring their survival and comfort. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. The native peoples understood something about color that modern science has only recently confirmed. Dark colors absorb heat from the sun, while light colors reflect it. In deep winter, when every bit of warmth matters, garments would often incorporate darker furs or dyes to maximize solar heat absorption during the day. But in spring, when the sun became stronger and overheating became a concern, lighter colored garments would be favored. This wasn't written down in textbooks or scientific journals. It was knowledge embedded in practice, passed down through generations of observation and experience. The maintenance of winter clothing was also crucial and ongoing. Hides had to be kept supple with regular applications of fat or oil. Seams had to be checked and repaired. Worn areas had to be patched before they became holes. The fur had to be brushed and kept free of ice buildup. On a practical level, the care of clothing probably occupied as much time as the original creation, and everyone in the household learned these skills from a young age. What began as simple necessity evolved into a complex cultural tradition, with certain families or individuals becoming known for exceptional skill in creating particular items. A parka maker whose seams never leaked, a boot maker whose mucklucks could last for years of hard use, a mitten maker whose creations could keep fingers warm in the worst conditions. These people would be highly respected and their work would be valued accordingly. And now, allow your mind to float gently into the next chapter, where we'll explore the spiritual and psychological strategies that helped people maintain their humanity and hope through the darkest months, the stories and ceremonies that made winter not just survivable but meaningful. Picture, if you will, the depths of winter, when the sun rises late and sets early, when the days are so short that there's barely time to call them days at all, when the darkness seems to stretch on forever, and the cold is so persistent that you can almost forget what warmth feels like. This is the time when the physical challenges of winter are matched or even exceeded by the psychological ones, when the isolation and monotony and darkness can wear on the human spirit in ways that are hard to articulate but deeply real. Let me share with you how the native tribes who lived through these impossible winters fought back against the darkness, not with weapons or tools, but with stories, with ceremony, with the power of human imagination and connection. Imagine the gentle scent of sage smoke and burning cedar as the evening settles in, as the fire is built up a bit higher, as people gather close and prepare to spend the night hours together, holding back the dark with nothing more than their voices and their presence. The winter nights were long, and this meant time for the stories that couldn't be told in the busy season of spring and summer and autumn when there was too much work to do. These weren't casual entertainments or simple fairy tales for children, though children certainly listened and loved them. These were the repositories of cultural knowledge, of history and geography and spirituality and practical wisdom, all woven together in narratives that had been refined over countless retellings, polished smooth like river stones by the passage of time. The storytellers, and there were always particular individuals who were known for their skill in this art, would begin to speak, their voices taking on a different quality, a rhythm and cadence that was almost musical. The stories would often begin with traditional formulas, phrases that signaled to everyone that this was sacred time, that attention must be paid. The fire would crackle, casting dancing shadows, and the storyteller would begin to weave their tale. Some stories explained the origins of the world, how the earth was created, where the people came from, why things are the way they are. The Iroquois told of Sky Woman who fell from the heavens and landed on the back of a great turtle, and how from the mud brought up from the bottom of the primordial sea, the earth was formed on the turtle's back. The Lakota spoke of Inyan, the rock, who created the world from his own blood, giving life to all things. These weren't abstract theological concepts divorced from daily life. They were living stories that connected the people to the land, to the animals, to the very stones beneath their feet. Other stories taught practical lessons disguised as entertainment. The trickster tales, featuring characters like Coyote, Raven, Nanabozo, or Iktomi depending on the region, were full of mischief and humor, but they also demonstrated the consequences of greed, foolishness, arrogance, or breaking societal rules. A child listening to the story of how Coyote's greed led to him losing a feast would internalize the lesson about sharing and moderation without ever feeling lectured. The laughter and entertainment made the lesson stick in ways that direct instruction never could. And some stories were maps, literal guides to the landscape that encoded crucial survival information in narrative form. A story about a hero's journey might actually be describing the route between one village and another, with landmarks disguised as characters or events. A tale about where certain spirit beings lived might be warning about dangerous terrain, thin ice, unstable cliffs, areas prone to avalanche. This information was too important to be forgotten, so it was wrapped in a story, made memorable, and passed down through generations. Let me tell you about a sweet treat that was often shared during these storytelling sessions, something to give people a little pleasure during the long dark hours. Birch syrup, similar to maple syrup but made from the sap of birch trees, has a unique flavor that's more complex than maple. Slightly minty, with notes of caramel and a subtle spiciness. This syrup would be collected in early spring, usually March and April when the sap was running, and some would be preserved specifically for winter use. During storytelling nights, small amounts of this precious syrup might be mixed with snow to create a sweet, icy treat, or drizzled over bits of dried berry cake or fried bread. The sweetness would wake up your taste buds, the cold would refresh, and the treat would become associated with the pleasure of gathering together, making the memory even stronger. But there was also savory food shared during these gatherings, and one of the most communal was stew cooked in a large communal pot, with everyone contributing something. Someone might add dried meat, another person dried berries, another some dried roots or tubers they had stored, another some herbs for flavoring. The pot would simmer over the fire for hours, the ingredients melding together into something greater than the sum of its parts, and when it was ready, everyone would share, passing around bowls and eating together. The taste would be rich and complex, different every time depending on what went into the pot, but always warming and satisfying. This kind of communal cooking typically happened during the coldest months, January and February, when the stored foods needed to be carefully managed but people also needed the emotional lift of gathering and sharing. The act of everyone contributing and everyone receiving in equal measure was itself a story, a demonstration of the values that held the community together. And then there was the unusual food that came with its own stories and significance. Dried fish eggs, or roe. In the regions near salmon runs, the roe would be carefully extracted during the autumn catch, then dried or smoked until it formed dense, savory lumps that were rich in oil and protein. The taste is intensely fishy, almost briny, with a texture that's slightly chewy and a richness that coats your mouth. Small amounts of dried roe could be eaten as is, providing a quick burst of energy and nutrients, or it could be crumbled into stews to add depth of flavor and richness. The preparation would happen during the salmon runs, typically in late summer and early autumn, around August and September, and it was often the work of elder women who knew exactly how to process and preserve the eggs so they wouldn't spoil. There's something deeply soothing about imagining these gatherings, isn't there? The sense of togetherness, the shared attention to the storyteller's voice, the way the fire would flicker and the shadows would dance, the occasional burst of laughter at a particularly funny moment in the tale, the quiet sighs during a tragic part. These weren't just people passing time until spring. These were communities actively creating meaning, maintaining their culture, strengthening their bonds, remembering who they were. The ceremonies and rituals of winter served similar purposes. Many tribes had midwinter ceremonies, elaborate multi-day events that combined spiritual practices, social functions, and practical activities. The Iroquois midwinter ceremony, for example, could last up to 9 days and included dreams recounting and interpretation, stirring of ashes to honor the dead, ritual games, feasting when food allowed, and ceremonies to give thanks for the year past and ask for blessings in the year to come. These weren't somber, joyless affairs. They included humor, playfulness, socializing, and genuine celebration alongside the more serious spiritual elements. The winter dances served both spiritual and physical purposes. Dancing generated body heat in communal lodges, provided exercise during a season when people were otherwise relatively sedentary, and created a shared rhythmic experience that bound people together. The drums would beat, the singers would chant, and people would dance sometimes for hours, their movements telling stories, honoring spirits, celebrating life in the midst of the season of death and dormancy. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. Many tribes had specific stories that could only be told in winter, when the earth was asleep and certain spirits wouldn't be offended or disturbed by the telling. To tell these stories in summer was considered dangerous, potentially bringing misfortune or angering powerful beings. This created a special anticipation for winter, a sense that this difficult season also brought unique gifts and experiences that couldn't be had any other time of year. The elders held special importance during these winter months. Their knowledge and wisdom were valued year-round, of course, but in winter, when physical strength mattered less and mental and spiritual strength mattered more, the elders came into their own. They were the keepers of the stories, the ones who remembered the hardest winters and how the people had survived them, the ones who could provide perspective and hope when things seemed darkest. A community that honored and cared for its elders was investing in its own resilience and continuity. It's surprising how much these intangible practices mattered, perhaps even more than the physical adaptations. Humans can endure tremendous physical hardship if we have meaning, connection, and hope. But comfortable humans with no sense of purpose or community can fall into despair. The native peoples understood this intuitively, and they built their winter survival strategies around psychological and spiritual resilience as much as around physical preparation. What began as necessity, the need to pass time during long dark nights, evolved into rich cultural traditions that became ends in themselves, valued not just for their survival function but for the beauty and meaning they brought to life. The stories became art, the ceremonies became expressions of identity and spirituality, the gatherings became the very fabric of community. And now, as your body sinks deeper into relaxation, as your breathing becomes slower and more peaceful, allow your mind to drift gently into the final chapter, where we'll explore the end of winter, the signs of spring's approach, and the renewal that came after months of darkness and cold. There comes a moment in the deepest winter, often in late January or early February, when something shifts. The change is so subtle that you might not even notice it at first, but it's there. The days are beginning to lengthen, adding just a minute or two each day, but it's enough. The angle of the sun changes slightly. The quality of light becomes different, less flat and dim, gaining a hint of warmth even though the temperature might still be brutal. The native peoples who lived through these impossible winters learned to read these subtle signs with the skill of master interpreters, and they knew that no matter how hard the present moment was, change was coming, the wheel was turning, and spring would return as it always had. Let me share with you what this time of year meant to those who had endured months of cold and darkness and the constant challenge of survival. Imagine the gentle scent of snow beginning to change, losing that dry, powdery quality of deep winter and taking on a slightly denser, wetter character that signals the approach of thaw. Imagine the way the light lingers a bit longer each evening, the way the birds that had stayed through the winter begin to sing differently, with notes that speak of anticipation and preparation. The indigenous peoples marked this turning point with observation and ceremony. They watched for the first signs of animal activity, bears beginning to stir in their dens, though they wouldn't emerge for weeks yet, wolverines and foxes becoming more active as the breeding season approached. They watched the trees, looking for the subtle swelling of buds that indicated the sap was beginning to move. They watched the ice on rivers and lakes, noting when it changed from that deep, solid blue of midwinter to a grayer, more honeycomb texture that meant it was beginning to weaken from beneath. This was a time of both hope and danger. Hope because spring was coming, because the long darkness was ending, because soon there would be fresh food again and warmth and the return of green things. But danger too, because the stores were often at their lowest point. The food that had seemed adequate in autumn had been stretched thin by months of careful rationing, and there were still weeks or even months to go before the first spring plants would be available, before the migrating animals would return, before the fish would begin their spawning runs. This period was sometimes called the hunger moon or the starving time, and it required every bit of the physical, mental, and spiritual resilience that had been cultivated over the preceding months. This was when the community bonds mattered most, when those who still had something shared with those who had nothing, when the strong helped the weak, when the collective survival instinct overrode any individual hoarding or selfishness. The elders would tell stories of past springs, reminding everyone that this had been endured before and would be endured again, that their ancestors had survived and so would they. The storytellers would shift their repertoire slightly, choosing tales with themes of renewal and hope, of heroes who persevered through terrible trials and emerged victorious, of the cycles of death and rebirth that governed all things. Let me tell you about a sweet food that became almost unbearably precious at this time of year. The very last of the maple sugar or birch sugar, saved from the previous spring and carefully hoarded through the winter, might be brought out and shared in tiny portions, a reminder of sweetness, a promise that spring would bring more. Sometimes just a few grains on the tongue, melting slowly, the concentrated sweetness seeming almost overwhelming after months of bland, preserved foods. This sugar represented not just flavor but memory and hope. Memory of the spring just past, hope for the spring to come. The last of the previous year's sugar would typically be completely exhausted by March, making these final tastes all the more precious. But there was also savory food that marked this transition period, and one of the most important was the first fresh meat of late winter. As the days lengthened and the weather occasionally moderated, hunters could sometimes venture out with renewed success. A snowshoe hare caught in a snare, a ptarmigan shot with an arrow, even a few fresh fish caught through the ice. These small additions to the diet of dried and preserved foods were received with tremendous gratitude. The taste of fresh meat after months of drying was almost shocking, the juices and tenderness that had been absent from jerky and pemmican suddenly returning, reminding everyone what they had been missing. These late winter hunts would begin in February and continue through March, often targeting smaller game that required less energy expenditure to hunt than large animals. And then there was the unusual food that signaled the very first stirring of spring, the buds and inner bark of certain trees. The Ojibwe and other northern tribes knew that the inner bark of white pine, carefully stripped in thin layers, could be eaten raw or boiled. It was slightly sweet, with a resinous, almost citrusy flavor, and while it wasn't exactly delicious, it was fresh, it was green, and it provided vitamins that had been lacking from the winter diet. The buds of poplar and willow could also be eaten, though they were often quite bitter and required careful preparation. These tree foods would typically be harvested in March as the sap began to rise but before the leaves emerged, making them some of the very first fresh foods available after the long winter. There's something almost magical about imagining this transition time, isn't there? The way hope begins to build slowly, carefully, not wanting to be disappointed but unable to resist the signs of change. The way people would begin to talk more about spring plans, about what they would plant, about where they would travel, about repairs and projects that had been postponed. The way children would become more energetic, their spirits lifting with the lengthening days, their play becoming more vigorous and joyful. The breakup of the ice was a momentous event, celebrated and sometimes feared in equal measure. When the ice on the rivers began to crack and groan, when the pressure of the moving water beneath finally overcame the strength of the frozen surface, the breakup could be dramatic and even violent. Great slabs of ice would pile up against each other, creating temporary dams that would then burst free in rushing torrents of water and ice chunks. It was dangerous to be too close, but it was also thrilling, a demonstration of the raw power of nature, a clear signal that winter's grip was finally releasing. The first geese flying north, their distinctive calls echoing across the sky, would bring people out of their homes to watch and listen. The return of the geese meant that somewhere, not too far away, the snow was melting and the ponds were opening up and the grass was beginning to green. It meant that the migratory animals would soon follow, the caribou herds moving north to their calving grounds, the buffalo herds beginning to disperse from their winter ranges. It meant that the fishing season was approaching, that the spawning runs of salmon or whitefish or other fish would soon begin. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. Many tribes had specific ceremonies to welcome spring, to give thanks for survival through the winter, and to ask for blessings for the season ahead. The Iroquois maple dance, performed when the sap began to flow, honored the maple tree and the gift of sugar. The Ojibwe offered tobacco to the spirits of the trees before tapping them for sap, showing respect and gratitude. These weren't empty rituals but expressions of a worldview that saw humans as part of nature, not separate from it, that recognized the web of reciprocity and obligation that bound all living things. The tapping of the maple and birch trees was one of the first major activities of spring, often beginning in March when the nights were still freezing but the days were warming above freezing. This temperature fluctuation created pressure in the trees that pushed the sap up from the roots, and by making a careful cut and inserting a spile, the people could collect this sap in birch bark containers or animal bladders. A single tree might produce gallons of sap over the course of several weeks, and this sap could be boiled down into syrup or sugar, or it could be drunk fresh, providing sweetness and hydration and a sense of celebration. The sugar camps became social gatherings, with multiple families often working together, the children playing in the warming sunshine, the adults tending the fires and stirring the boiling sap, everyone basking in the knowledge that winter had been survived once again. There would be storytelling and laughter, and the first batch of fresh sugar would be celebrated, often with ceremonies and feasting using the last of the winter stores combined with the first of the spring bounty. And then there was the unusual food that signaled the very first stirring of spring: the buds and inner bark of certain trees. The Ojibwe and other northern tribes knew that the inner bark of white pine, carefully stripped in thin layers, could be eaten raw or boiled. It was slightly sweet, with a resinous, almost citrusy flavor, and while it wasn't exactly delicious, it was fresh, it was green, and it provided vitamins that had been lacking from the winter diet. The buds of poplar and willow could also be eaten, though they were often quite bitter and required careful preparation. These tree foods would typically be harvested in March as the sap began to rise but before the leaves emerged, making them some of the very first fresh foods available after the long winter. There's something almost magical about imagining this transition time, isn't there? The way hope begins to build slowly, carefully, not wanting to be disappointed but unable to resist the signs of change. The way people would begin to talk more about spring plans, about what they would plant, about where they would travel, about repairs and projects that had been postponed. The way children would become more energetic, their spirits lifting with the lengthening days, their play becoming more vigorous and joyful. The breakup of the ice was a momentous event, celebrated and sometimes feared in equal measure. When the ice on the rivers began to crack and groan, when the pressure of the moving water beneath finally overcame the strength of the frozen surface, the breakup could be dramatic and even violent. Great slabs of ice would pile up against each other, creating temporary dams that would then burst free in rushing torrents of water and ice chunks. It was dangerous to be too close, but it was also thrilling, a demonstration of the raw power of nature, a clear signal that winter's grip was finally releasing. The first geese flying north, their distinctive calls echoing across the sky, would bring people out of their homes to watch and listen. The return of the geese meant that somewhere, not too far away, the snow was melting and the ponds were opening up and the grass was beginning to green. It meant that the migratory animals would soon follow, the caribou herds moving north to their calving grounds, the buffalo herds beginning to disperse from their winter ranges. It meant that the fishing season was approaching, that the spawning runs of salmon or whitefish or other fish would soon begin. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. Many tribes had specific ceremonies to welcome spring, to give thanks for survival through the winter, and to ask for blessings for the season ahead. The Iroquois maple dance, performed when the sap began to flow, honored the maple tree and the gift of sugar. The Ojibwe offered tobacco to the spirits of the trees before tapping them for sap, showing respect and gratitude. These weren't empty rituals but expressions of a worldview that saw humans as part of nature, not separate from it, that recognized the web of reciprocity and obligation that bound all living things. The tapping of the maple and birch trees was one of the first major activities of spring, often beginning in March when the nights were still freezing but the days were warming above freezing. This temperature fluctuation created pressure in the trees that pushed the sap up from the roots, and by making a careful cut and inserting a spile, the people could collect this sap in birch bark containers or animal bladders. A single tree might produce gallons of sap over the course of several weeks, and this sap could be boiled down into syrup or sugar, or it could be drunk fresh, providing sweetness and hydration and a sense of celebration. The sugar camps became social gatherings, with multiple families often working together, the children playing in the warming sunshine, the adults tending the fires and stirring the boiling sap, everyone basking in the knowledge that winter had been survived once again. There would be storytelling and laughter, and the first batch of fresh sugar would be celebrated, often with ceremonies and feasting using the last of the winter stores combined with the first of the spring bounty. What began as a desperate struggle to survive the most brutal season had brought the community closer together, had tested and proven their resilience, had reinforced their cultural values and spiritual practices. The people emerged from winter not weakened but strengthened, not diminished but renewed, carrying with them the knowledge that they had faced the worst the world could offer and had not just survived but had maintained their humanity, their joy, their connections to each other. It's surprising how much strength can be found in endurance, how much wisdom can be gained from hardship, how much appreciation for warmth and light and green growing things can develop from months of cold and dark and frozen stillness. The native peoples who lived through these impossible winters had a relationship with the seasons that went far deeper than mere survival strategy. They understood themselves as part of the cycle, participating in it, shaped by it, but also shaping their response to it through their choices and their culture. And now, as our journey through this remarkable history comes to its close, as you lie comfortable and warm with no winter to endure, no hunger to fear, no darkness pressing in, perhaps you can appreciate more deeply both the incredible resilience of those who came before us and the relative ease of our own lives. Perhaps you can carry with you some small portion of their wisdom, the importance of community, the value of preparation, the strength found in stories and ceremony, the knowledge that difficult times pass and light returns. Thank you for traveling through this gentle piece of history with me. for allowing me to share these stories of survival and adaptation, of human resilience in the face of conditions that seem impossible. If you drifted into peaceful sleep somewhere along the way, I hope you found rest and pleasant dreams. If you're still here with me now, I hope these stories gave you a new appreciation for the ingenuity and strength of the native peoples who not only survived impossible winters but created rich, meaningful, beautiful cultures in the process. If this journey helped you unwind, if it gave you something to think about as you drift off to sleep, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, and what time of year it is in your part of the world. And if you'd like more stories like this, stories that honor the past while helping you find peace in the present, consider subscribing. But only if it feels right to you. There's no pressure here. Just an invitation to join me again sometime, when the night is quiet and you need a gentle place to rest your mind. Until then, sweet dreams, my friends. May your sleep be peaceful, your rest be deep, and your awakening be gentle. Good night.